Thanks, Jess. Welcome, everybody. We're excited to have you here. My name is Amanda Hornberger. I'm on the board of the World Affairs Council. I'm also the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading and co-chair of Literature Berks. This program is brought to you by Literature Berks and the World Affairs Council of Reading. In the chat, you can see a link to purchase a copy of The Unexpected Spy from our official book vendor, Reads and Company Bookshop. We're happy to continue to support a local independent bookstore, and we encourage you to continue to shop local during this time. And remember that books always make great gifts. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Tracy Walder. Tracy worked as a staff operations officer at the Central Intelligence Agency's Counterterrorism Center Weapons of Mass Destruction Group. During her time at the CIA, Tracy traveled to Afghanistan, Jordan, Uzbekistan, Algeria, Morocco, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, and England. During this time, Tracy received many awards for her service from both the CIA and foreign intelligence offices. Among her awards were 4 Exceptional Performance Awards from the Director of the CIA, 2 Special Activity Awards, a Meritorious Unit Citation Award, a DCI Counterterrorism Center Medal, and 2 Operation Enduring Freedom Targeting Awards. After the CIA, she became a special agent at the FBI's Los Angeles field office, specializing in Chinese counterintelligence operations. She's done a TED Talk and is a sought-after public speaker through the World Affairs Council, and I'm honored to welcome her to today's program.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Amanda. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So for a few minutes or so, I wanted to, walk you all through my book and then hopefully answer some audience questions as well as some moderated questions as well. I'm very excited to be here. I apologize, I'm a little tired. I've been up since 3. I'm also a national security contributor to a few of the news organizations around. So sometimes I have some early morning wake-up calls like I did this morning. But anyways, I wanted to just give you a little sense of my life prior to being at the CIA, during the CIA, and then sort of what I'm doing now. A little bit. So I grew up actually in Southern California. That's where I'm originally from, even though today I'm coming to you from Dallas, Texas. I grew up a Jewish girl in the middle of Southern California in a place called Van Nuys, and then my parents moved to Orange County when I was about 6-7 years old. I actually was born with a developmental disability. I was born in the 1970s, so to age myself, but a lot of research at this time really wasn't done on what I had, and quite frankly isn't even known now about it. It's called hypotonia, and it's actually really common amongst Ashkenazic Jews. Like my brother had it as well, and so did my dad. But what it meant is that my muscles didn't develop. Either they developed too slow or some didn't develop at all in the way that like a normal baby would develop. So, most kids are starting to maybe crawl at, 9 months or so, walk at about a year. I didn't even start sitting up until I was about 1.5 years. And then I didn't walk until I was almost 3. So I did all of the milestones. They were just extremely late. And, I remember the doctor sort of telling my mom, she'll never be athletic, she'll never be a dancer, but she's alive, she's fine, her brain is fine, it's all okay. We didn't have really physical therapy to go to at that time. And so, my parents just kind of pushed through. But when I was in about 3rd grade, the bullying because of it started. And so I'm very clumsy. I still am to this day. I trip and fall a lot. My knees will buckle a lot. And kids can be really mean. I don't know any other way to say that. And they were pretty horrific to me, really all the way up until my senior year of high school. I think at the time, obviously I didn't appreciate the behavior. It was really hard on me. But looking back, I actually think that it is what drew me into the study of history, the study of foreign policy, and really wanting to explore the world. I didn't have a lot of friends, and I became very, very close with my parents. And one of the things that they did, my dad was a professor. My dad every year would have these conferences that he would go and present his psychology papers at. And, he got free plane ticket, free hotel. And so he would take our family. And I got to really see the world as a result of that. So instead of, birthday presents, Hanukkah presents, Christmas presents, that's what we did. And I think, when you're 13. I don't think you really appreciate that. But now at my age, obviously I do. And my dad is a huge history buff, and he started giving me books to read on the Civil War. And I just really became interested in history. I became interested in the world. And a lot of that was because I quite honestly spent a lot of time alone. And when I was a junior in high school, I really, when you're bullied, your greatest goal in life is really to blend in. You don't want to be noticed at all. And so I did a really great job of that. I was really, not remarkable in any fashion, never gave anyone any trouble. I really just blended. And I had this teacher my junior year of high school, and it was in a US history class, and he would not allow me to blend. He forced me to participate. He forced me to participate in history extracurriculars and things like that. And I think it was from him that I decided, I want to be a high school history teacher. He has really influenced me. I love history. I think, being in the high school would be a great place for me because I can maybe help change things for kids like myself. And so I know this sounds crazy, but back in my day, I applied to 2 colleges. Both are where I got free tuition because that's where my dad was a professor. And I went to the University of Southern California, or USC is where I selected to go. And I decided to, obviously major in history, and I was going to be a high school history teacher. Well, I kind of got a little, I guess, sidetracked, if you will. And I was taking some of my GE classes when I was a freshman, and one of them was Intro to Economics. And I wasn't super great at it. And I had to meet with my professor, who happened to be the dean of the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences at USC. And, he asked me what I was going to do with my history degree. And I said, don't you just become a teacher? Isn't that what you do with a history degree? And he said, well, there's actually so many things. Let me print you out a list of internships that you could really explore. And so I think that was the first time that I thought sort of off that teaching track a little bit. And I started almost like checking boxes of the list that he gave me. And I interned for a senator, and I loved that. I interned at a museum, and that was fantastic. I interned at a law firm, loved that. And so I really started applying my degree in different ways that I didn't expect. But one day, it was 1997. So I believe I was a sophomore in college and beginning my sophomore year. And I was working out and watching TV, and I was watching CNN, and I saw an interview. And the interview was with this guy. His name was Osama bin Laden. And I think, a lot of people, it's hard to put ourselves back into a world where international terrorism sort of wasn't front center. The terrorism that I grew up with, and again, I'm kind of in my early mid 40s, was Oklahoma City bombing, Waco, Ruby Ridge. That was my frame of reference, really, for what terrorism was, not sort of these attacks over there. Yes, we had things going on in Saudi Arabia and Nairobi, and but I don't think that was really front center for me growing up in high school and college. And so, he was this new person on the scene. And it was in that interview where he declared war on the United States. He issued his fatwa, or declaration of war. And even more so as, I guess, the 19-year-old self-centered college kid, it became personal to me because he also declared war against the Jews. And I thought, wait, where did this? And that really sort of piqued my interest because I grew up I'm not deeply religious, but I grew up a Reform Jew. And at my temple growing up, there was always a security guard. There was always a metal detector. There was always a police officer. And I don't think I really understood why. I don't really think I had anything that taught me why. And so I think when I saw bin Laden, and then shortly thereafter, there was a shooting at a JCC very close to USC, actually. I started to just wonder. I didn't get angry. I really got curious. Where did all this come from? And as crazy as it might sound, USC at the time did not offer international terrorism classes. It just wasn't a thing. Now they obviously do. But I started trying to piece together how to fill that void. And I started taking Middle Eastern history classes, international affairs classes, politics classes, really just trying to see how I could understand this. And USC has career fairs, just like really any other college does. And the CIA comes to those career fairs just as they do to a lot of schools throughout the US. And I actually wasn't going to go to that career fair because I didn't really know who at the time worked terrorism. I know that sounds strange, but again, I don't even think there was a new James Bond when I grew up. I think it was probably still Sean Connery. So I didn't have a lot of the pop culture that folks have today, with Homeland and Criminal Minds and all those kinds of shows. None of that existed. And so I think maybe the fact that I had no expectations was probably a good thing, because it kind of had me go in with my eyes just wide open. And so I went to the career fair that I didn't really want to go to. I had my resume on me, and I saw there was a table for the CIA, and that at that point in time, they were really looking for liberal arts majors, so history, English, psychology, sociology, those kinds of things. And I gave the recruiter my resume, and I said, do you work terrorism? And, he said, yes. Yeah, I mean, it's not a huge focus, but yes, we do. We have a counterterrorism center. Okay. And I just sort of continued on my merry way. I remember I was going to my astronomy class, and I don't think I thought anything else about it. I would love to tell you that working at CIA was sort of my live stream. It wasn't, because to be honest with you, I didn't really even know what it was, quite frankly. But a few weeks later, they called, and I think I decided, I'm going to go for it. Why not? It's kind of how I've always lived my life. And so I started going through the recruitment process, which is an interview, background check, polygraph, all of those kinds of things. I was pretty young, so I didn't have too much of a background, I guess, to be checked. And I was fully cleared by November of my senior year. So they issued me a conditional offer of employment, which was obviously contingent upon my graduation. And so I graduated from USC, and just a few weeks later, I started at the CIA. So at the CIA, and I'm sure a lot of you know, you don't necessarily get to tell them where you want to go. It doesn't quite work like that. Perhaps things have changed, but as far as I know, they have not. I had an idea where I wasn't going to go. I knew I wasn't going to go to the Directorate of Science and Technology. Those are folks that have physics degrees, engineering degrees, math degrees. No one really wants me doing that. I knew I wasn't going to go to the Directorate of Intelligence, which is where the analysts live, because I was very unqualified, quite honestly, to do that. Most of those folks have very specific master's degrees and PhDs in their subject matter. You're talking, like South Korean politics, PhDs in that. And that wasn't me. I had a very broad liberal arts degree. And I thought I probably wasn't going to go into the Director of Administrations. Most of those are CPAs, human resources, those kinds of things. It just wasn't my background, but you never know. I thought I might go into the DO, which is where I guess the spies live. We are the collectors of human intelligence. So we go to try to recruit foreign assets overseas to give us information. That's our job. And that is where I was put. A lot of us have broad bachelor's degrees. The vast majority of my friends were liberal arts majors who are in that. And I was placed in the Counterterrorism Center, not because I'm fabulous. Really, all the fabulous people were working in the Russia group, or at that time, there were a lot of issues going on in Latin America, particularly in Colombia, Guatemala, Nicaragua. And that's where a lot of the more seasoned folks were, quite frankly. Counterterrorism was sort of new. At that time, it was very teeny tiny. And so that's where I was placed before September 11th. And, before you go to your training at the farm, CIA is a little different than FBI. You actually are at headquarters for a while, which I think is actually a great thing. And my job was to look at terrorist training camps, trying to get information on them, who is coming in, who is going out, changes in activity, changes in vehicles that would signal something. And that is what I was doing on September 11th. I was working terrorist training camps. And so I was at CIA headquarters on September 11th, which is always fun that at cocktail parties when people try to play that game of where were you on September 11th. I feel like I can usually win that one. And we lived there for a couple days, about 2 to 3 days. We slept there. I don't think we really wanted to go home, quite frankly. I think a lot of us felt that we were responsible for September 11th, and we wanted to fix it. And so pretty soon after September 11th, I started working something else that I had actually been briefed into before September 11th. It was myself and two other gentlemen. And it was to sort of talk around it, but we were doing some real-time things in Afghanistan to try to neutralize certain targets. And I did that. I was in a very small room, and the president was in and out of there all the time. George Tenet, who was the director at the time, was in and out of there all the time. And, you know, it was quite the experience. I was on duty the night that we lost bin Laden in a place called Tora Bora, and that was really difficult for me. After I rotated off of that project, I started doing my overseas rotations. I never had a chance to. Obviously, I went to the farm, but my farm training looked very different than what other people's probably did, in that those of us who were in the Counterterrorism Center before September 11th were not allowed to be gone for 4 months at a time for training. So our training was very piecemeal. It would be 3 weeks here, 3 weeks there, which was fine. And I did a lot of overseas tours during that time, and I was particularly focused in their weapons of mass destruction group. So my job was to try to find terrorists who were trying to acquire and use weapons of mass destruction, but not in, I guess, the nuclear sense. If you will, Al-Qaeda doesn't have the infrastructure really and capability to acquire a nuclear weapon. It's just not in their wheelhouse of things to do. We're talking more kind of crude toxins and poisons, those kinds of things that would enter into a water supply, beauty products, things like that. So that was my job, was to try to find people who would tell me about attacks that were going to happen. And it's funny, we can talk a lot about CIA's failures, but I'm not allowed to talk about any of the attacks that we actually stopped. So that is the work at the CIA, and that's sort of what we are, I guess, known for, is our failures sometimes, and not our successes. I loved the CIA. I loved everything about it. I still talk to my colleagues there all the time. They were bridesmaids in my wedding, some of them. But I made what I thought was actually a mature decision to leave after some time. Being there before, during, and after 9/11 was a lot. And I was living in different places probably every 5 months or so, every 2 months in some cases. It just depended. And so I think that for me, I needed a little bit more stability. I didn't see that this was a life that I could continue for sort of any real length of time. It wasn't going to be good for me. And so I decided, the overseas aspect of the CIA is never going to change. I can't change that, nor do I want to, about them. And so I made the decision to leave on a really high note, actually. And I decided, I want to still work counterterrorism, but I want to do that here in the United States. And so the next logical step for that, because the CIA is an intelligence apparatus, is an international apparatus, was to, so sorry, bird just flew into the window, was to work for the FBI as a special agent. And so I left the CIA on a Friday, and I started at Quantico on a Monday. And in my class, there were 40 of us. That's a typical Quantico class size, 34 men and then 6 women. Not an unusual arrangement to me, because you have to remember, of the places I lived, a lot of times I was the only female. And we went around and introduced ourselves, and it became quickly apparent that the FBI was a very different place than the CIA. And it was really interesting. A lot of my colleagues there had to work really hard to pass a lot of the academic tests that we had to take there. They're not easy. Those were easy for me. For me, I had to work 2 to 3 times harder than everyone else to pass the physical tests. because of my body and because of what I had. And I passed all of them. And I was really proud of myself, actually, for that, because I was always told that I wouldn't be athletic, but I passed them all. And actually, to this day now, I'm actually really athletic as a result of that. I'm never going to be a gold medalist, but that's okay. And so after I graduated Quantico, I was really lucky in that I was sent to the LA office, but even better, I was sent to the Orange County office. It's just a smaller office, which is exactly where I was from. So I was really excited about that to, I guess, be going home. But instead of counterterrorism, I worked Chinese counterintelligence. That's where they saw my value, which was fine. I am always up to learn something new, even though that wasn't my background. It was really interesting. It was really one of the first large Chinese counterintelligence cases that was worked here in the US. They had been here for 30 years, these operatives, and they stole our radar cloaking paint technology that we would use to make submarines invisible underwater, which may seem small, but it's actually quite detrimental to our national security and to our military security. And that was I really enjoyed it. However, the level of gender discrimination and sexual harassment, unfortunately, that I experienced when I was there was really difficult. And I made the decision at that point to leave. And so I left and I decided, well, I guess it's time to be a high school history teacher now. And so I went and I got my master's, and I ended up, my very first teaching assignment was teaching in that same classroom with this same teacher who inspired me to be a history teacher. So that was my very first job teaching. But I like to say that the CIA taught me what I want to teach, and the FBI taught me who I want to teach. And so I moved to Dallas about 3 years into my teaching tenure, and I actually started teaching at an all-girls school. And I started realizing they had a lot of questions, the high school girls did, about my job and my career and what I used to do. I started realizing, wow, they are not learning a lot about, foreign policy and all of this throughout, high school curriculum. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to create a class. I'm going to create a class with framework and curriculum on teaching this. And my focus would be to teach it to young women. And hopefully they would maybe help narrow the gap in foreign policy and national security. And right now in national security, only about 26% of the jobs are held by women. And in the FBI, only about 16% of FBI special agents are women, which is very low in my opinion. It's not to say we don't need the men in those positions. We absolutely do. But I think we need to have a little bit more equality in terms of who is represented. And then about 10 years into doing that, a nonprofit organization was started that was going to bring this curriculum throughout the US to girls throughout the United States. And so I work with them now. We do war games and things like that with the young ladies. And I also am a professor of criminal justice and domestic terrorism in Fort Worth at Texas Christian University. And so I guess it's kind of all come full circle, but I think the reality is I wouldn't teach what I teach if it hadn't been for the two careers that I had. And it's funny, I had, when my book first launched in February of 2020, I did an event at the Spy Museum, and over 40 of my students surprised me when I was there, and they all now work in national security related jobs, kind of all over the US and all over the federal government. And I think it was a really neat thing to be able to see that all come full circle. So with that, I would really love the opportunity to take your questions.
Thank you so much. I love that full circle moment, your first teaching job and you're back with that teacher. I think it's so important to remember those educators who really made those impacts on us and our lives. So you mentioned it a little bit on 9/11. We just commemorated the 20th anniversary. So there was a lot of kind of back and forth. Can you explain a little bit more, like, what was that time like for you professionally? You mentioned the vault. I think that was really impactful part of the book for me.
So yeah, the 20th anniversary just came up, and it was interesting. That impacted me more than I thought it would. I don't know if it was because I did a special on CBS about it with some other agency folks, and we finally had time to all, I guess, get together and talk about it, which is something that we really hadn't had the opportunity to do. I really don't know why this anniversary was more impactful than others, but I think for us, there's this weird degree of PTSD, right? That this was our fault and that we caused the deaths of all of these people. And I know that I personally did not do that, but I think it's still a difficult thing sometimes to work through because there's so few people, right, that were in that situation with you that you can talk to them about it. And so the vault that I went to work in really immediately after September 11th, that was something that I had actually been briefed on about a couple days prior to September 11th. And I knew that I was going to be transitioning to that. At the CIA, it's very common to sort of move around. It's not because you're bad or good, it just kind of is. And so I knew I was going to be transitioning to that. I just didn't know it would happen that quickly. I think their time on working on that would be, within the next 6 to 8 months, something like that. But obviously it started right away. And now that I look back on that program and what I was able to do, I realized I was the first person, along with those two other gentlemen, to do that. And now it's clearly taken on a life of its own. But I don't think I realized that until I had gone for that interview and started talking with some of my colleagues about it, that we were sort of the first folks to do it. And, there are morality questions around it and everything. But I think at the time, I felt that we were doing what was best. I fully supported at that time, the invasion of Afghanistan. So the vault was, for me, being 22, probably 23 at the time, and sitting there, with President Bush over one shoulder, Condoleezza Rice, and they're pretty much all the time because it was so new, what we were doing. I guess it causes you to kind of grow up pretty quickly and really learn what good leaders are at the time. And Tennant was very good to us. I mentioned in my book that he brought us Thanksgiving dinner in there and cooked it himself. And he was a very good leader.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned earlier too, just how, the CIA and all intelligence agencies really get blamed for all the things that go wrong, but we have no idea of the hundreds and probably thousands of terrorist attacks that you have prevented from happening. So I think that's so enlightening. You mentioned a little bit in your book that you had a lot of additional trainings and that you moved around. What would the trainings be like? Were they just those little 3-week stints, or can you describe those for us a little bit more?
So here's the problem.
You probably can.
In my book, for those that get it, you will see that there are redacted sections, which means blacked out sections. So basically what you see is funny. Somebody who reviewed it said I was lazy for leaving them in, but what you don't realize is that is actually 5 full rewrites of my book to get it to look the way that it does. When I first got it back from CIA, it had 8 chapters fully blacked out. To include the one that is called Crash and Bang, which is in my book, that details a certain section of my training. It was fully redacted. They would not let me publish it. And so I had to appeal certain chapters and certain decisions, and then I had to rewrite certain chapters and certain decisions. And so that was one that I appealed and won and was able to put it in. But I think it's that one and Poison School are the only 2 that were allowed in my book that I'm allowed to talk about. I'm so sorry. But Crash and Bang was learning how to drive. Well, it's a couple things. It's learning how to drive a stick shift vehicle, because most countries do drive stick shift vehicles and we do not. So they want you to get very comfortable with it. And that does take place at the farm. It's also crashing your car into things, learning how to be ambushed and how to understand that and take that. So a lot of what I like to call situational awareness training, right? Being in these difficult situations and figuring out what you're going to do in them. And then Poison School was obviously very specific to my group, in that we had to learn how to make the poisons, how cheap they were, how easy they were to make. A lot of it's kind of on the job training, I guess, if you will.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Can you talk a little bit more about how did you stay yourself? I mean, I think most people would think by looking at you, you don't really look like a spy. You don't look like James Bond. You kind of look like the girl next door. So how were you able to maintain your sense of identity as you did this kind of work?
So I think what was so great is that the CIA wants you to maintain that sense of identity. They want you for who you are, whomever you are. And I really appreciated that about the organization. And I think sometimes something that I wrestle with in the narrative, I guess, that I'm trying to change, I guess, is that what's a spy supposed to look like, right? What's an FBI agent supposed to look like? And it's okay to be extremely feminine and like feminine things and still have that dichotomy of loving the other stuff as well. There's nothing wrong with that. And so for me, I mean, things that I did, and quite frankly, a lot of my colleagues did. I loved to, do my nails. I loved to get my hair done. Those kinds of things are things I never stopped doing ever. And everyone honored everyone for who they are, whomever they were. And I've really appreciated that about the agency.
Yeah, that's awesome. You mentioned it a little bit. How did the work that you did in the intelligence field, specifically in the CIA, affect your personal life? Were you allowed to, there was a question that came through, like, were your friends and parents allowed to know that you worked in the CIA? Like, how did that all work?
Yeah, so in terms of my friends and parents, yeah, I was what 99.9% of CIA employees, I think what people don't realize are actually overt employees. Most people can tell people that they work at the CIA. It's actually a very small portion of people who can't, and you would be surprised by the people who can't. It's typically folks in human resources, actually, that can't say where they work. And so for me, I was able to tell people that I worked there, but at the time I couldn't tell them what countries I was visiting because I had cover when I was in those countries. So I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, a question just came in from Aaron. Can you tell us about any of the countries that you visited? I know I mentioned some in the introduction, but countries that you were in during your time in the CIA.
I guess specifically, what about them? I guess the most recent, the one that's been in the news the most would be Afghanistan, probably. Afghanistan is, I think maybe what was so hard about September 11th this year too was everything that was going on in Afghanistan too, which was a country I grew to really love and loved living in. I think I like to call Afghanistan, pop culture calls it where empires go to die, but I like to call it where, kind of God forgot about it. It's very interesting. When I lived there, there was one paved road, I think. And then, once we invaded Iraq, a lot of people assumed Afghanistan looked like Iraq, right? Because you're seeing Iraq in the Middle East and you're seeing Iraq, quite frankly, it has infrastructure, it has roads, it has, multiple story buildings, it has a banking system, it has all of those things. Afghanistan truly has none of that, or didn't have any of that when I was there. I'm assuming it's similar now. And I think you don't realize how primitive it is. And so I think that was one of the most eye-opening experiences for me when I was there.
I'm going to put another link in to the book. Here it is. It's The Unexpected Spy. It's a great read. It's a fast read. Someone asked if it's appropriate for teenagers. I would say yes, but I don't. Tracy, what would you think?
My students, they read it, and they are ages, 14 and up. I would not let my 6-year-old.
Not really bedtime story material.
But it really depends on what you're okay with. There is language in there. There is discussions of torture, killing. It really just depends on, I think, what a parent is comfortable with having their child read. But if I had a high school, I would let her read it, but I don't.
Thank you. One of my favorite stories in the book is actually in the very beginning, wherein you take some fruit with you when you go to interrogate a terrorist. Do you want to explain a little bit? I just thought that was such an interesting insight into the tactic of talking to terrorists and stuff.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times what we see in movies is sort of this like rough and tumble, big dude trying to beat information, I guess, out of a terrorist. And I think for me, obviously, that's not, something that I would do. And what I started to realize is it's very similar to how you would recruit an asset overseas. You have to find commonality with them. You don't want to create an acrimonious relationship with them, or else they won't trust you and give you information. And so I started to learn about some of these guys, about what they liked, what they disliked, what foods they liked, what foods they didn't like. And I realized that this one really liked oranges. And so I really needed the information regarding the location of something very badly. And so I brought him a bunch of oranges that day to sort of open up the conversation with him. And I think he was really shocked that I remembered what he told me. Even though, he's in custody and I'm not, I think he was happy to know someone cared enough about what his likes and dislikes were. And ultimately, after a little bit of talking, it didn't happen right away, but ultimately, he did give me the location of something that I needed. And I really do think it was because I had taken the time to listen to him and taken the time to learn what his likes and dislikes are.
Yeah, that personal connection that's, often overlooked, like you said, in, media portrayals. It's never that. It's the beating up. It's not the, one-on-one interactions.
Yes.
Related to that question, Randy had a question. Did your gender help you to spy in cultures like the Middle East, for example, giving you access to women, or was it more of a hindrance?
I think that's a really good question. How about if I say both? But some of it too, you have to remember my job is to get information out of people. And so if men assume that because I'm a female and because I look a certain way, I'm stupid, that's fine because I'll work that to my advantage. Which is a terrible thing to say. So a lot of times that hindrance or, men blowing me off or not thinking I'm smart enough was actually very helpful because they say and do things in front of me that they think that I don't care about or not smart enough to know about. But what I will say is in the Middle East, the vast majority of folks, and it was mostly men, quite frankly, who I was working with, were quite good to me. I never had too many issues. I had one issue. And I think, they were mean and calling me Barbie and all of that. But I think it had nothing to do with mean, everything to do with the fact that they didn't like our CIA station chief. And I was there at the behest of him. And I think they were just taking that out on me now that I really reflect back on that. But for me, I actually view my gender as helpful for the most part, because if people are going to underestimate me because of it, that's completely fine. I will work that to my advantage.
I love that. We have a question from Jesse, not from the perspective of counterintelligence efforts, but from the perspective of local settings and cultures. What areas of the world would it be, quote unquote, easy to be undercover, and where is it harder for the CIA to send someone and have them be effective?
Well, I mean, for me, sometimes in the Middle East it was easier because you just disguise yourself with a burqa or an abaya, and no, it's so much easier to, I guess, blend, if you will. The CIA, I will say, is very much doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. You're going to go where your expertise is, and you'll just sort of work around it that way. Because, sometimes we need women to recruit women assets as well, particularly in the Middle East, where you wouldn't want a man working with a female asset. And so I wouldn't say there's an easy or a hard undercover. One of the places that I was actually not allowed to go was Israel. I wasn't allowed. The CIA did have a policy against Jews, Jewish members of the CIA meeting with the Mossad or Shin Bet and going to Israel. And that was because I don't think it was that they didn't trust us. I think it was that the Mossad would view us as targets and try to recruit us. And they really just didn't want us in that position. So to this day, I still have never been to Israel. I looked across it from the Dead Sea, but I've never been to Israel and I would like to go. But I think that would be the only place where they just wouldn't let me go undercover.
So you talked a little bit about the sexism that you faced, and you just touched on a little bit your Jewish faith. Did you ever face anti-Semitism in your career among Americans or overseas partners?
So I mean, when I was overseas, it didn't come up, right? Except for the one time I was having a discussion with a terrorist and talking to him, and I asked him a very basic question. Why do you hate Americans? I think a lot of us want to know the answer to that. And he said, I don't hate Americans. I hate the Jews. And I so badly wanted to say to him, I am Jewish. But then I realized, got to take one for the team here. And I can't tell him that because he will shut down and not give me information that I needed. But the reality is it's easy for me to just not tell people that I'm Jewish. So I never faced anti-Semitism. The only time I ever faced any pushback, I wouldn't call it anti-Semitism, was that my grandpa died. When I was at Quantico. He died right in the middle of my training. And you are allowed to leave to attend, funerals when you're at Quantico. However, we bury our dead very quickly in my religion. And there was a lot of people higher ups not wanting to let me go because they didn't understand why he couldn't be buried, 5 days later. But I don't think that was anti-Semitism.
Right. Awesome. Can you talk a little bit more about how you use your experience in your work today? I know you talked about teaching and, reaching these young women. And is it more, do you feel you want to encourage them to step outside their, their safety, their blending in zones and, to explore more? Or do you think it's more just to kind of share your experiences and, share what you've learned along the way?
So I try to actually not really share any of my experiences or my opinions with my students. They get really mad. They don't like it because they just want to hear all about, and that's not the goal of what I'm doing. I'm not here to teach them how to think about certain issues. That's not my job. But I am here to teach them about these countries or about a political situation that's going on there or about a foreign policy issue. So that way they can explore what they want to do with it. And so I recently had a student just maybe 2 weeks ago messaged me, and she is an art major actually at a university. And so I never thought that she would go into, this kind of work. But, what was interesting is she said that after taking my class, she now has decided that she is going to get into the cinematic arts, and she is going to make documentaries, particularly documentaries in sort of the Turkey, Iran, Iraq area on women that are there and what their struggles are. And she said that it was my class that taught her different applications of it. And I'm not looking to make them, cookie cutter spies or cookie cutter FBI agents. But I think the fact that she can still impact the world, but in a way that she's passionate about, then I feel like my job is sort of done there.
That's amazing. I love that. I love that one course sparked an idea and, leads to something totally different that you never would have. Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. And we had a question from TAC. What foreign languages do you speak and what types of training did you get on foreign language?
I don't speak any foreign languages. And so the reason for that, is a couple fold. So when I started at the agency, they usually update their website pretty regularly about what languages that they are looking for. And so when I started there, they were looking for Russian and Spanish speakers. And so obviously I don't speak either of those. Clearly they hire people that don't speak those languages. And so you have to remember, this is before September 11th. And the reality is really none of us spoke those languages that were in the Counterterrorism Center. And so obviously once September 11th happened, they clearly started recruiting people. They changed their foreign language focus, right, to Urdu, Pashto, Farsi, Dari, whatever, Arabic. But the problem is that the CIA and most organizations, if they're going to send you to foreign language school, it's about a year. The training is about a year. It's completely immersive. And the problem is we couldn't afford to be gone for a year. They didn't want us to be gone for a year. We were the only people that were still around before September 11th. And so I think had I stayed longer, 10 years in, 15 years in, I probably would have been sent away to language school. But during the time that I was there, I was not sent away to language school because I couldn't be gone at language school. And quite frankly, most terrorists, there's a great book out, The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright. It's older now, but most terrorists speak English because they were educated either here or in the UK.
That's great. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Lausch. If you have other questions, please feel free to stick them in the chat. What advice would you give to young females hoping to enter the intelligence field today?
That's a good question too. So I think for me, I always get asked, what did you major in? What GPA did you have? What languages do you speak with? Right? What are all these different boxes that you can check? But that's really forced me to reflect on, why did the CIA want me? Right. I had a good GPA, and, I went to a good school, and, I had this very broad liberal arts degree. I don't think I had anything that was very different, right, than a lot of people have. I know I don't mean that to sound bad, but, people can get good grades. This is some do, some don't. And I had to think about it, and I really saw that reflected in two of my students. And I think this is where my advice would come in. Is I had two students, former students, that were going through the process. I still keep in contact with them, and they're in college. And one went to Harvard, which is arguably, right, one of the top schools. And the other one went to University of Alabama, which is also a great school as well. But I would say that they're probably viewed differently, right, in pop culture throughout the US. The one at Harvard had a 4.0, had done many internships overseas in different embassies and things like that, spoke 3 languages fluently. And then the one that went to University of Alabama, she was an engineering major, had, like B+, A- GPA, not a whole, no overseas experience other than, traveling with her parents, those kinds of things, and spoke a little bit of Spanish, but, not a ton. And the interesting thing is the one that went to University of Alabama is currently the one employed by the CIA. The one from Harvard did not get the job. She was cut after the second round. And I've talked to both of them, and she's fine now. She's doing just fine. But I had to think about, why? Why did one get it over the other? And I realized the one that went to Alabama had far better, I guess, what we call soft skills. So critical thinking, empathy, conflict management. Hers were just, and they always had been. She knew that about herself, and the other person knew that hers were not good. And what I realized is mine were good too. And I think a lot of times we get stuck in this, what box do I need to check about? What school do I need to go to? What major do I need to have? Yeah, try to learn a foreign language. I think that's just a good thing to have in general. But I think we forget about those other skills that we really need to be successful in these jobs and to be successful in the workplace in general. So don't forget about your soft skills.
I love that. That's so important. Thank you. Dr. Lausch?
Okay, well, and Tracy, just hang with us because there may be a question or two yet at the end here that someone might want to bring forward. But thank you very much for being with us today.
Of course.
It's a topic that we certainly don't often get to address. That is the modus vivendi of our counterintelligence services in the United States. Upcoming for us here in October 27, and Tracy, incidentally, we are going to have the first of 2 presentations from folks on the topic of Afghanistan. Dr. Larry Woodson will be speaking about what went wrong in Afghanistan. And he is a professor of Middle East Studies at the U.S. Army War College. And we think that will be very interesting for us to have because we'll be following a bit later with the second presentation. In November, we do have 2 programs scheduled. I don't have the details on the one because we haven't yet posted it and gotten it all, but it is scheduled. But we also have a presentation on cybersecurity with an old friend of ours, Captain Paul Totera, from the retired from the U.S. Naval Academy, U.S. Navy, excuse me, and he is the director of the Center for Cybersecurity Studies, and in fact was the first chair of the new Cyber Science Department at the United States Naval Academy. Then we returned to Afghanistan, December 1, with Ambassador Ronald E. Newman, who is a former ambassador to Afghanistan. He is the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy and was formerly a deputy assistant secretary of state, having served as an ambassador to Afghanistan, to Algeria, and Bahrain. Very much looking forward to that. We'll have two different perspectives, probably, certainly some differences on the topic of Afghanistan. We close our year December 8 with a presentation on the World Health Organization, the WHO, and global health governance, lessons from the pandemic, with Dr. Irene Langman, who is the professor and chair of the political science department locally here at Albright College. So we think we have a good solid set of bookings for people coming up. We're able to track interest throughout a program. And I can tell you, Tracy, very few people have left us. You held the attention. So is there anything parting that you would like to leave with us that might certainly encourage us all to get your book and read more about it? You were, for example, I'll ask you a question if I may.
Sure.
And from the streaming, you had to sometimes assume aliases. That's something we expect of a spy. So could you maybe give us an example of that?
I unfortunately cannot. That is all tradecraft that is protected by the CIA. I'm so sorry.
Sure. Okay.
Right. We had another question that came in through the chat. Tracy, why do people in the Arab world hate Jews? I know it's a 1,000-year thing, but did you find anything specific? Thank you for your presentation.
Gosh, great question. It's a long answer. However, I guess on just the very surface level, to answer that question, I will be very frank with this audience and say, I don't think I understood the Arab world until I went and lived in it. I think I had preconceived notions about the Arab world. I'd never been there. I'd never met anyone, that was Muslim and that was from there and that was practicing. And I think it leads to conclusions that I make, right, without that firsthand experience. And I have to tell you, after spending the time overseas, one of the things that I've learned that fuels some of this fire, not all of it, is just a complete lack of trying to understand the other's culture and the other sort of point of view. You don't have to agree with it, but like to understand it. And I think it helped soften me a little bit to the issue in terms of understanding these things about the Arab world. So I realize that is a very superficial answer. Obviously, there's a lot more layers to peel back of that. But, I don't want to get into sort of Israel-Palestine conflict questions, just because I know that that's sort of a third rail kind of issue, which I can talk to privately. I just don't really want to in a recorded setting. But I do think that a lot of it is from this lack of understanding of the different cultures. And I am happy that I lived in those countries. I'm happy that I got the opportunity to meet Arabs and to understand their religion a little bit more.
Thank you. That's a great question. I had a question about cybercrime. You did work with that when you were with the FBI. Can you talk about how social media platforms are supporting or giving a platform really for this type of like hate crime and speeches?
So I didn't do cyber at the CIA. The FBI did Chinese counterintelligence. But in terms of cyber stuff, it is giving a huge platform, obviously. It's funny, yesterday in my domestic terrorism class at TCU, we just did, a whole unit on cyber communications, right? And how they're utilizing these things to grow their networks, like 4chan, 8chan, even just like truck radios and things like that. I think that is the problem. That's how ISIS is recruiting, quite frankly. Al-Qaeda is kind of not with the program yet in terms of that. And I do think we talk about wanting to make these social media networks more accountable for what they're doing. And I agree that we need to be. But then again, how do you figure out what is wrong with what is being perpetrated, or being sort of spewed on these sites? Is difficult because people have First Amendment rights. So it's a really difficult thing. We have social media. It's not going away. We're not shutting it down anytime soon. So it's just figuring out how to navigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, last question. Biggest challenge of your work and most rewarding aspect of your time in the intelligence field?
Okay, so strangely, I would say the biggest challenges were, I know this is going to sound hugely superficial, but was the pay. I will never forget sitting on the floor of my apartment with my best friend at that time, and us just like marveling at the fact that we couldn't afford to go to a movie that we wanted to go see. Yet, like, we almost died in Afghanistan, for our country, and we weren't living lavishly. I had an apartment, I had a car, but nothing, outside of our means, and it was crazy to me. Sort of, that was a very difficult part of the job. I think also too, sometimes being thrown in a country where you've never been before, that has a completely different culture than yours, can be a little bit scary and somewhat overwhelming. But the best part is sort of that as well, was being thrown into these other countries and learning about cultures that I don't think I would have ever had the opportunity to learn about. Was definitely the best.
Well, Tracy, thank you so much for joining us today. This was really interesting. We learned so much. The book is called Unexpected Spy. It's available in the Berks County Library System. You can also order through the link in the chat. If you want them signed, I can try to get you connected with Tracy, and I'm sure she could sign some book plates, and then we could send them to you. But none of the copies that we have are actually signed so far. But thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.